Welcome back to Panda's Nightmares. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most feared and mysterious legends out there, Skinwalkers. These shape-shifting beings come from Navajo folklore, and the stories surrounding them are some of the most bone-chilling you'll ever hear. People claim to have seen creatures mimic human voices, take the form of animals, and stalk them in the dead of night. Whether you believe in them or not, once you've heard these stories, you'll never walk through the woods the same way again. Before we begin, I want to share something personal. I'm raising funds for my dad's medical treatment, and your support means the world to me. If you'd like to help, the GoFundMe link is in the description below. Thank you for being here now. Let's step into the shadows and hear the stories of those who believe they've encountered a Story 1. I've spent the past 2 summers guiding canoe trips in Lake of the Woods, which stretches across Minnesota and Manitoba. It's one of the most remote and hauntingly beautiful places I've ever been, but it's also a place rich in ancient presence and stories. The Ojibwe have lived in this region for thousands of years, and there are many areas we're not allowed to camp on because they're part of the reservations. The region is often called Wendigo Country, and there are even locations named after it, like the Wendigo Islands. There are a lot of stories passed between guides. Some are chilling, some are almost whispered warnings, and I could share a few of those. But I'll start with the one experience I was personally involved in. It was me, another guide, and about 7 campers, teenagers, on a multi-day trip. Our first night out, we camped on a site known as Little Trisket. That evening, as we were preparing dinner around the fire, one of our campers, who was on the autism spectrum and had some communication challenges, began acting uneasy. He kept asking things like, "Who is that man in the woods?" and pointed toward the dark tree line behind us. He described what he saw as a tall, skinny man who was all white. Naturally, we were unsettled. We reassured him that no one was back there, did a head count to confirm everyone was present, and checked out the area. There was nothing in the woods that we could see, so we brushed it off and kept making dinner. Later that same night, the only girl on our trip, who had her own tent, shouted out, "Gilly Vanilly, stop." That was her nickname for us guides. We called back from our own tent, "What? We're in here." She just let it go and didn't say anything more. The next morning, we asked her what happened. She said something had been shaking her tent violently, and she thought it was one of us messing around. When we took down her tent, we found 2 of the stakes bent at a full 90-degree angle. We tried bending them back ourselves, just to see if they were flimsy, but they didn't budge. I've been through some fierce windstorms out there, gusts up to 40 miles per hour, and I've never seen stakes bent like that. It wasn't windy that night. The boys were all in their tents, and my co-guide and I never left ours. We left Little Trisket the next day, and the rest of the trip went off without a hitch. The weirdness stopped, but when we got back to base camp, I talked with another guide who had stayed at that same campsite the following night. I hadn't told her anything about what happened. Her face went pale, and she said, "There's some kind of big white creature at that site." She told me she had gone into the woods to use the bathroom and saw what she thought was one of her campers walk toward her, and then suddenly turn and run. But when she got back to camp, everyone was still there around the fire, and no one had left. That was my first real experience with something out there, and honestly, I hope it's my last. Some other guides have shared much scarier stories, some involving voices, shadows, or even full apparitions. And many of them seem to happen after someone disrespected the land, joked about the spirits, or claimed not to believe in any of it. We try to treat the wilderness and the spirits here with the utmost respect. Whether that truly protects us or not, I don't know, but it helps me sleep a little easier. Story 2. This one is a story I was told by one of the other guides, who had spent around 6 years guiding canoe trips in Lake of the Woods. Let's call him Stephen. I want to remind you that I did not experience this myself, but Stephen had told me about a few experiences he and other guides he worked with had. What I do want you to know is that we do not joke around about Wendigos at our place of work. We don't tell these stories to campers anymore, and we don't even say the name, we only refer to them as W's. So while this is not something I witnessed, it's not the kind of thing we make up to scare people. It's treated with real seriousness. I'm not an expert in Wendigos or Native American and Canadian culture by any means, and I hope not to offend anyone. The knowledge I have has just been passed down through other guides and their experiences. One detail that I should explain before telling Stephen's story is that a definite way to tell you're seeing a Wendigo is if the creature or animal has two bright, glowing red eyes. One summer, about 5 or 6 years ago, Stephen had a couple of encounters with the Wendigo. His first encounter was on an early trip in the season where their destination was Shoal Lake. It was a 6th-day trip with about 60 miles of paddling and one portage, where you carry your canoes and packs overland into Shoal. On day 4, they were portaging back out of Shoal through a route called Deadman's Portage. It sounds made up, like something from a horror story, but that's genuinely what it's called. I have no idea why it's named that, but it feels fitting. There's a campsite about half a mile from the portage that's frequently used. We just call it Deadman's. Stephen and his trip were planning to get through the portage and stay at that campsite afterward. The portage itself is a bit long, but is like a highway, well maintained and relatively flat. I believe it's one of the only portages in Lake of the Woods that the Canadian Parks Service actually clears regularly. The short paddle from the portage to the campsite goes through a narrow inlet with 10 to 15 foot cliffs on both sides, draped in moss and shaded by beautiful old cedars. It's surreal and peaceful until it's not. That evening, just before they were settling in for the night, they realized they had left their sleeping backpack at the end of the portage. It was around 9, so the light was fading fast. Stephen and one of the campers hopped into a canoe with their headlamps and paddled back to retrieve it. The paddle took them about 30 minutes, and by that time you could only really see what your headlamp was aimed at. They grabbed the pack and started paddling back. Not long after leaving, Stephen began hearing loud splashes behind them, things falling into the water. He dismissed it at first, thinking it might be beavers. That's pretty common in the area, and their tail slaps on the water can sound exactly like big rocks being thrown. But the splashes kept coming, and they were close, too close. Then Stephen saw it. A massive rock, roughly the size of a basketball, flew through the air and landed right next to their canoe. They started paddling like mad, every muscle straining, trying to get back to the safety of the campsite. Between strokes, Stephen looked back and up at the cliffs behind them, and that's when he saw them. 2 bright, glowing red eyes, staring at him from about 15 feet above. Whatever it was, it had stopped throwing rocks, but those eyes never blinked. They made it back to camp without further incident, and the rest of the trip passed uneventfully. But Stephen said he never felt the same about Deadman's Portage again. Neither do the first. Whenever I go through there now, I triple check that I haven't left anything behind, because I don't want to go back. Story 3. Incident 1. The Window Incident. This first one happened late at night, usually between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. I would be lying in bed when I'd start hearing knocking or scratching at my window. Some people tried to explain it away, saying it's just the window adjusting, or maybe raccoons, possums, rats, or even bugs. But here's the thing. My window had never made sounds like that before, and it's way too high off the ground for animals like that to reach. Even with the lights off, I could still hear the tapping. One night it got worse. I was on my bed when I heard the usual tapping, but then I heard footsteps outside. Not animal sounds, but clear footsteps. Something walking on 2 legs. Then I heard the front door in the living room open. After that, the footsteps came again, this time sounding like they had claws at the end of their feet. They walked round inside for a bit, and then I heard the front door close. Whatever it was had come in and gone back out. Incident 2. My pets are possessed or something. This one's about my cats, and I swear something's not right with them. One time I was trying to get my cat Bear out from under my bed, but my dad walked in and said she was under the kitchen table. Thing is, I had just seen her under my bed. When I went to look again, sure enough, Bear was still there. I had even put her outside earlier. Somehow, she was in 2 places at once. Another day I came home from school and accidentally stepped on something under the blanket on the floor. I looked over and saw Bear in the kitchen, and Bit, my other cat, was on my bed. But something had been under that blanket. An hour later, I made some coffee and set it down on my nightstand. When I leaned over to take a sip, I saw Bit under my bed, his neck twisted like it had snapped as he crawled under. The way he looked at me gave me chills. I leaned down for a better look, but he was gone, just vanished. The whole time though, Bit never moved from my bed. And then, just recently, I was out on my dad's porch when he told me he saw a cat that looked just like Bit, black and white, walking around. The thing is, Bit had died just a week earlier after getting hit by a car. There are no other cats around us. We live in the middle of the country. Incident 3. The outside. These last few things keep happening when I'm alone outside. The first time, I heard rocks being thrown onto the roof of our porch. There were no storms, no hail, and it came out of nowhere. It was quiet otherwise. The scariest part, though, is the garage. I keep hearing something slam into it. Sometimes I'll see it move, like something's inside or hitting it hard from the outside. People might say it's just the wind, but there's no wind. It's totally still. And yet, it keeps happening. Story 4. Well, this happened a little while back. In my hometown, there's a forest that's said to be haunted, according to local tales. Me, my buddy, and a female friend of mine decided to explore it, because we're ballsy like that, at around 1 a.m. The forest was tricky to navigate. It had a lot of uneven terrain and specific pinch points, so we had to be careful where we stepped. It was also incredibly dark due to the thick tree coverage, making it feel like we were walking through a tunnel of blackness. We were only in there for a few minutes when I started getting this eerie feeling, like we were being watched. I turned around and saw something I'll never forget. 2 white glowing eyes staring at me from behind a tree. I froze. For a solid 5 seconds, we locked eyes. Then, whatever it was slowly backed away and disappeared behind the tree. I immediately told my friends that we needed to get out, now. Halfway through our exit, the forest suddenly filled with the most terrifying sound I've ever heard. It was like a distorted woman's scream mixed with a wolf-like howl. It felt like death itself had just screamed at us. We froze, our blood running cold. We moved as quietly as possible through the trees, trying not to make a sound. As soon as we stepped onto the open grass patch that led out of the forest, we ran, full sprint, hearts pounding, pure survival mode. When we finally stopped, about 300 yards away, I turned back for one last look. There it was again. Those same glowing white eyes were staring at us from the forest's edge, locked directly on me. A black figure, tall and shadowy. Then, in a blink, it darted off to the right, so fast I couldn't even register its movement. I've never gone back there since, and I probably never will. Story 5. My grandmother on my mother's side has always been very superstitious, for lack of a better word. She's not religious, but she strongly believes in the paranormal. Her mother was full-blooded Navajo, and her father was Irish. She never lived anywhere east of Montana and spent most of her life in Nevada. When I was in grade school, we went to visit her. Most of the trip was uneventful, typical, boring old people stuff. But one thing that stood out was how she always kept the curtains tightly drawn. She'd constantly peek through them, watching the outside world with a nervous tension. Whenever someone asked what she was doing, she would simply say, "Yenald Lucy is watching me." This went on for most of the visit. Then, just a few days before we were set to leave, something strange happened. My grandma and my then baby brother, he's 19 now, were in the front yard planting flowers in the evening when she suddenly shouted, "Brother's name, get away from that creature. It's not safe." Of course, being in Nevada, we assumed he had stumbled upon a scorpion, or maybe a rattlesnake. We all rushed outside, only to find my grandmother clutching my baby brother in her arms, shaking in terror and pressed up against the side of the house. Standing out in the yard was a large black dog, about the size of a Great Dane. It wasn't growling or snarling, just ... staring. Its eyes were deep yellow, and the intensity of its gaze was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It looked up at the rest of us, gave a little huff, and then bounded off into the distance. I can't remember if it moved unusually fast, but that image, the way it stared, has never left me. When my mum asked my grandmother what had happened, she just kept repeating, "The Yenald Lucy has found me." A few weeks later, she packed up and moved. Story 6. So this happened about 12 years ago. My family owns a farm in the heart of an Indian reservation. One winter, I was home for Christmas, taking care of the farm while my parents were away doing some last-minute shopping. It was late at night, and I was completely alone. Out of nowhere, I heard all our cows freaking out. That usually meant wild dogs were prowling, something that happens often in our area. So I threw on some boots, grabbed the shotgun, loaded it up, and headed out to the field to scare them off or take care of it if I had to. It felt like a perfect setup for a horror movie. The night was cloudy, but the full moon was breaking through just enough to light up the snow, covered ground in a cold, eerie glow. I made my way into the middle of the field, and just in time, I saw two dogs. They were standing face to face, like they were about to fight. Perfect, I thought. 2 for 1. I pumped a shell into the chamber of the 12 gauge, and that's when everything changed. The two dogs stopped mid-fight. Both of them turned and looked straight at me, and then they ran away on their back legs. I froze. Every ghost story I'd ever heard growing up on the reservation. Every tale about skinwalkers and shapeshifters. All the things the native kids told to scare us white kids came rushing back to me. Until that night, they were just stories, boogeyman tales, but that night they became real. Story 7. This is a story my family told me when I was growing up. We live in a rural community on the Navajo reservation. One evening, my aunt and her 2 brothers were home alone, while my grandparents had gone to a chapter house meeting. Like many homes on the reservation, there was no electricity. So by the time it had gotten dark outside, the house was quiet and lit only by lanterns. My aunt and uncles were getting ready for bed when they started hearing strange noises outside, the sound of someone moving things around. Curious and uneasy, my oldest uncle peeked out the front window and saw a figure by the truck. This was incredibly unusual. Our closest neighbor lived miles away, and no one should have been anywhere near the house. They watched as the figure opened the truck door and began rifling through the belongings inside. Terrified, but knowing they had to act, my aunt and uncles grabbed the rifle and braced themselves. They threw open the front door and aimed the gun at the figure, yelling to scare it off. But the figure didn't flinch. It turned slowly and started walking toward them, completely unfazed by the weapon. My uncle pulled the trigger. Nothing. He tried again and again, but the gun refused to fire. As the figure came closer, my aunt suddenly smelled the stench of decay, like a rotting corpse. It was so overwhelming it made her gag. Still, the gun wouldn't fire. Just then, headlights appeared in the distance. My grandparents were coming home. The figure paused, then darted off and tucked itself behind a tree near the house. My uncle ran toward the truck, still clutching the gun, and met my grandfather as he got out. Pointing at the tree, my uncle told him what had happened. They both saw the figure peeking from behind the trunk, watching them. Without hesitation, my grandfather ran inside, grabbed ashes from the stove, and rubbed them over the gun and a single bullet. He loaded the ash, covered round into the chamber, stepped outside, and fired toward the tree. This time, the gun went off with a crack. The figure didn't expect that. It bolted, running on all fours, like a wild animal. My grandmother pulled my aunt inside while my grandfather and uncles jumped into the truck and gave chase. With few roads or paths, the headlights bounced wildly as they drove through the rough terrain. My uncle swears that each time the headlights caught the figure, he saw a woman, and she was running, not like a person, but like a bear, on all fours. Eventually, the figure reached a deep ditch about 20 feet down and vanished into the darkness. My grandfather stopped the truck, got out, and began yelling into the night, shouting in Navajo. My uncle says he was calling out the name of a local woman, accusing her openly, telling her he wasn't afraid, and warning her to leave his family alone. A few days later, that woman, the one my grandfather had named, was found dead. I've always been told that if you know who the Skinwalker is, say their name out loud. It strips them of their power, and it can kill them. Story 8. When Joe was a kid, he said he and an older relative, maybe an uncle or grandfather, he couldn't remember, went out into the country to cut wood and load it into the relative's pickup truck. It was nearly dark by the time they finished, and they began the drive home down a long, treacherous dirt road winding through a canyon. The road was narrow, rough, and unlit, but the older relative kept a steady 35 miles per hour as they drove. About halfway through the canyon, things took a terrifying turn. Joe swore that, from the outside of the passenger side window, he heard a series of short but solid knocks, 3 or 4, quick and purposeful. Caught in confusion and fear, he started to turn his head to look. But before he could see anything, his relative shouted at him not to look and to put his head down. Then the relative slammed on the gas. Moments later, there was a sudden dip in the bed of the truck, as if something heavy had jumped in with the wood. Almost immediately after that, they heard another series of sharp knocks, this time on the rear window of the cab, coming from whatever had climbed into the back. The relative pushed the gas pedal even harder, the truck bouncing violently over the rough terrain. All the while, he was loudly chanting a prayer in their native language, over and over again, barely pausing to breathe. Just before they cleared the canyon pass, the weight in the back of the truck lifted, jumped out, or vanished. They didn't know. The truck steadied out, and a few minutes later, the relative finally told Joe he could sit up and look around again. When they got close to home, the relative warned Joe not to speak of what happened to any of the other family members, saying it would upset them. The next day, he took Joe to a local shaman to be prayed over, so the evil would forget their faces. Years later, Joe finally worked up the courage to ask his relative about that night. He asked him what it was, what exactly he had seen. His relative paused for a long moment, then said, "Eyes. Red eyes, like the tail lights on a car." Joe then asked why, if that's what he saw. He didn't slam on the brakes to throw it off. The older man was quiet again, then finally answered, "Because there was more than one." Story 9. My grandparents lived in South Texas, about an hour from the Mexico border. Their house was right next to a large canyon, the kind of place that always had an eerie, heavy feeling. After they passed away in the early 2000s, my cousins went over to start clearing the place out so renovations could begin. When they pulled into the driveway, they immediately noticed something was off. The front door was wide open. As they got closer, they could hear something rummaging around inside the house. One of my cousins decided to go in and check it out, while the other, feeling uneasy, stayed outside near the truck. The cousin who went in said he walked through the kitchen and into the living room. When he turned toward the hallway, that's when he saw it, a huge wolf digging through boxes. The moment the wolf noticed him, it stood up on its hind legs. He said it had glowing red eyes and was baring its teeth, but not growling, just staring at him. They locked eyes for a few seconds before the creature dropped back down onto all fours and bolted straight past him, right out the door. Outside, the other cousin saw the wolf come flying out of the house and take off toward the canyon. He ran to the edge, trying to follow it with his eyes. Just before the wolf disappeared into the brush, it stopped, looked back at him, and did something strange. He swears it showed its teeth again, not in a snarl, but almost like it was smiling. Since that day, no one has seen that wolf or any other animal near the property. Not a stray dog, not a raccoon, nothing. As a kid, I always felt weird about that canyon, like it was hiding something. I haven't been back in decades. Whatever it was, it sure wasn't looking for food. Story 10. A guy I used to hang out with once told me this story about how he, his brother, and a couple of their friends purposely tried to find a skinwalker. They drove out near a reservation in the woods somewhere in northern Minnesota and played what he called skinwalker noises to try to lure one out. By that, he meant they looked up sounds on YouTube, just a mix of disturbing groans and eerie screeches on a 1-hour loop, and blasted it from the car. They kept 2 windows down, the driver's side and the rear window behind it. Within 5 minutes of playing those noises, he said they saw this abnormally dark, shadowy figure, long and fast, sprinting right beside the car. They weren't going super fast, maybe 20 to 25 miles per hour, but this thing was keeping pace on all fours. Both he and the driver saw it clearly. He was sitting in the back seat, and he swore the figure had to be at least 10 feet long. It was too dark to make out a face, but the shape and movement were unmistakable. It didn't look like any animal they'd ever seen. Naturally, everyone in the car started freaking out. They floored it, trying to get out of the woods and off the reservation. Even as they sped up to 40 to 45 miles per hour, this thing stayed right with them, running alongside like it wasn't even trying. It only stopped chasing them once they reached the edge of the woods where the streetlights started. He and his brother both told me the story in vivid detail, and I could tell they weren't messing around. They were teens at the time, so they tried to keep parts of it lighthearted, but the way they described the figure and the mood shift when they talked about it, that was real. They both were absolutely convinced it was a skinwalker, or at least something not fully human or animal. They definitely got what they were asking for. Most stories I've heard about skinwalkers are people accidentally encountering them. These guys were actively seeking one out. Since then, as far as I know, they've never done anything like that again. And honestly, if that had happened to me, I don't think I'd even drive at night anymore. And that brings us to the end of tonight's chilling look into skinwalker encounters. If these stories left you feeling uneasy, or if you're second-guessing every sound outside your window, make sure to subscribe to Panda's Nightmares for more terrifying tales and real-life encounters. Hit that like button, follow for updates, and check out my other videos if you want more stories that'll keep you up at night. And just one more thing, if you can. Please consider supporting my dad's medical treatment through the GoFundMe link in the description. Your kindness and generosity truly make a difference. Thank you for watching, and remember, if you ever hear your name being called from the woods, don't answer. Stay safe, stay aware, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.